Welcome to Mile High Reefers. I'm Scott Anderson. In today's video, we're going to talk about why people Photoshop coral. And spoiler alert, it's not just people trying to sell you coral that don't exist.
Photoshop is a photo editing software by Adobe that allows you to edit photos. Now you can make very small changes to the photo up to crazy changes to the photo. But the term Photoshop has become synonymous with changing photos. Now, the reality is there are a bunch of programs out there that allow you to do this, and there are even programs that allow you to do this in camera. Think Snapchat.
So to begin with, we've got to get down to the basics on how a camera works. And we all have these crazy cool digital cameras these days, whether it's a big DSLR or a point and shoot or your cell phone. What we have these days are amazing. But the physics behind how a camera works is still very similar to how it used to be. So for this demonstration, I'm actually going to use an old Minolta film camera. So when you go to take a picture, before that picture is ever taken, there are 3 settings on your camera which will make all the difference in how your picture comes out. First is the aperture. So that's basically the size of the hole in the lens that the light goes through. Now in a cell phone, that's already predetermined. On a big DSLR, you can adjust it. So the bigger the hole, the smaller the aperture number. So a big hole would be like an f1.8 or a 2.8, something like that. A small hole would be like f22. The smaller the hole, the less light. The bigger the hole, the more light. Downside is, the bigger the hole you put, the smaller your depth of field is, so the more you have to deal with focus issues. So that is one of the first things that's going to happen. So the light's going through the lens constantly. It's got to go through that hole, which is your aperture. And then the next step is your shutter. So that's how fast that shutter opens and closes. Now, DSLRs and mirrorless cameras still have mechanical shutters in them. Your cell phone more than likely has an electronic shutter, but they basically do the same thing. When you push that button, the shutter opens, closes, light goes through, and on a modern camera, it hits the sensor, and on this camera, it hits the film. So the third thing that you can adjust early on that's going to affect how your picture comes out before it ever really hits that sensor, or right when it hits that sensor, is your ISO. And that's how sensitive the sensor is to the light. In the case of this old film camera, your ISO was actually your film speed. So remember the old days when you bought 400 speed film? That was your ISO. Now you can change it in camera quickly, and in fact you can have your camera do it automatically, but that is going to be pre-baked into the image that comes. So you got to get that ISO right to begin with. So as far as ISO goes, the lower the number, the less sensitive the sensor is, but the better the quality of image you get. The higher the number, the more sensitive the sensor is, but the less quality image you will get out of it. So if you can, you want to shoot like ISO 100, 200. But of course, even though we feel like our tanks are really bright, they're nowhere near as bright as bright sunlight. So you're probably going to be pushing higher than that when you take your pictures of your aquarium. So now that light's hit the sensor and your sensor produces an image, 2 types of images can be produced. You can get a raw file, which is basically the direct information right off of the sensor, or you can get a JPEG, which is the processed raw file. Now, higher end cameras like your big DSLRs and mirrorless will let you choose one or the other or both. The majority of cell phones will take you right to JPEG, which is a processed image. So now some of you are probably thinking, well, problem solved. To fix the Photoshop and processing issues, let's just put those raw files out there. Well, the reality is that information coming right off your sensor is a really pretty ugly image. It's going to be low color saturation, it's going to be really flat, low contrast. Basically, they're unusable photos. The reason camera companies make these flat, boring images is because they are the best images to process. So regardless as to whether you did a JPEG or a RAW file, your image has got to be processed if you want to get your coral photo looking anything like that coral you're trying to take a picture of. Now, most of us in our aquariums were running these really blue lights, at least compared to natural sunlight. And the reason we do that is because that's how we get the cool colors and cool fluorescence out of our coral. The problem is camera sensors are not designed to take that blue image and do anything great with it. If you've ever taken an image of a blue tank with your cell phone, odds are you've seen these terrible just blue images come off your camera. The reality is that color you're seeing with your eye is not picked up by your camera sensor. So we have to adjust it somehow. To get rid of that blue color, we've got three options. We can either stop the blue before it ever hits our sensor with an orange filter. This one is from Aquaria Clip. It goes right over your camera sensor, and that orange gel filter will actually cut through the blues and show something closer to real life. The bad news is it's not 100% perfect. So then from there we have the camera software. So whether it's a DSLR or a cell phone, you're gonna have the ability to adjust your image within the camera. So that's your next option. And of course, third is Photoshop, Lightroom, or any of the other popular photo editing softwares out there. But because of the way we run our tanks, because of how blue the lights are, we have got to make adjustments to get our coral colors to be anything like what we see in reality. So I think we're at a great point where I can say why people Photoshop coral. The reality is, with current camera technology, you basically have to get a coral to look the way it does to your eye. And when I use Photoshop, I use it as a broad term as any form of processing. So let's take everything to one step further. Let's talk about buying coral online. People get blamed for photoshopping, and it's not always fair to do so. The reality is when that picture is taken, you have all of the processing that goes into taking that picture we just talked about. There's a lot there. Plus you have the lighting that the coral is under. And of course, corals can change color over time. So if that coral had its picture taken a month ago and then sells a month later, the coral itself may have changed color. And then of course, when that coral is put in the mail, it has another chance to change colors. And then when you get it, there's a good chance your lighting isn't exactly the same as the lighting it was under. And then of course, there's the angle you look at the coral. As you change the angle you look at the coral itself can change colors. My big clam is a perfect example. When you look at it from the side, it's this bluish burgundy color, and as you move to looking at it from the top, it turns to this teal color, which is really cool, but it really messes with people who are trying to buy stuff online. So the reality is taking pictures for online sales is really hard. And of course, buying stuff online is really hard, because there's nothing worse than getting that coral in the mail that you saw that amazing picture of, and it just doesn't look like that. And of course, from the seller's side, there's nothing worse than having an upset customer because the seller tried so hard to get you guys the right picture and it didn't work out. And of course, there are bad apples out there, and there are people who are trying to screw you, who will straight up photoshopping. So trying to iron all of that out can get really difficult. So thank you for watching this episode of Mile High Reefers. Like, comment, subscribe, and let me know what you think of all this.